Hello, welcome. I wanted to reach out to everyone that was not able to attend the faculty meeting for the fall 2023 update, and also to provide you with a chance to obtain the professional development that you need in order to maintain your faculty status. So we're going to go over really quickly, hit the highlights of the meeting notes, and we will go over that professional development course, which is on defining and implementing cultural humility in teaching and precepting. So just to hit some highlights from the meeting, we did welcome some new faculty members on board. We have our ASHE instructors that some of them have already been teaching for a little bit, and we already know that they've been teaching, but we still went on and acknowledged them, and that includes Aaron Beeman, Clayton Comer, Grace Gallinger, CJ Johnson, and Daniel Pennington as our ASHE instructors. And then we also included Nathan Kessler as our NAEMT instructor for PHTLS, and also he's picking up the ACLS PALS and GEMS courses. And then we also added on Alice Almond. She will be teaching our American Sign Language course that we've added to our community interest programs. And that will begin in January. So we're really excited to have her on board. She comes to us, she's a social worker with a master's degree in social work, and she is the child of deaf parents. So she is considered what is called a CODA, child of deaf adults, and she has a very unique perspective on sign language and working with people that have no prior information on that. So we're really looking forward to involving that program with our spring semester. We also included Karen Martin as our new Pearson VUE test administrator, and she is working as the education department assistant to help me with the daily tasks of running the department. Megan, as you may already know, Megan Cutlip was moved into the position of squad training officer, so she is working directly with the field crews and the personnel to make sure that their paperwork is ready for their recertification packets and to kind of guide them on that side of the fence. And she's working directly with Jason Connor on that side of the parking lot, if you will. But that is the new faculty and those kind of changes that have occurred. The faculty handbook was revised just to fix the typographical errors and some of the numericals that were messed up in that faculty handbook. So that's been corrected. Any place in that faculty handbook where you saw instructional faculty used, we removed the word instructional because it's really just redundant, and so we just sliced it down to call faculty, and that was it. We also streamlined some of the language under the job descriptions toward the end of the handbook. Nothing was changed in it. It's all the same. It just, we adjusted the format so that it was a little bit cleaner and easier to read. We also updated the ADA compliance officer for third parties and for employees, and that is now Jason Connor. That was added into the book. We also added a section on page 6 of the faculty handbook that covers what it means to have asset accreditation, to be recognized by the West Virginia CTCS system, and also COA, which is our programmatic accreditor for paramedics. So you can always go into that section of the faculty handbook and take a look at that. That is on page 6. Some additions that were made. Previously, the concept of the Pearson VUE Test Center and the Pearson VUE staff position, those were not included as part of the education department, and now they have been engaged or implemented as part of the education department. So we did add those job descriptions, so those two were added. In terms of additions to the catalog, I already mentioned that we included the beginner ASL course that will be starting in the spring. We did adjust the fees to the EMT course. We raised the fee to $650. And our EMT course will now include 12 hours of ER internship rotation in addition to the state minimum required of 10 hours on the ambulance with 10 patient contacts. We also made an adjustment to the refund policy in the catalog. We previously had it prorated at when they hit the 75% mark, they were prorated up to the 75% mark, and then at 75% they were responsible for the whole cost of the program. We have now adjusted that to match asset standard, which says that at 50% we can ask for the entire course payment at that point. So we did fix that. Now we do have an upcoming COA visit. That's the the Committee on Accreditation of EMS Programs. COAMS is going to be specifically looking at me, the documentation for the paramedic program, and we'll speak directly to not only graduates of the paramedic program, current students, and all the faculty that are involved in paramedic education. So that's what they'll be here for. They're expected to be here sometime between July 2024 and December 2024. So we've still got some time for that, but I did want to give you guys a heads up. In terms of changes to the National Registry, the National Registry has adjusted the examination program. They are now, this goes into effect on July 1, 2024. Any course that takes the paramedic program or paramedic exam after that date will have the new examination in place. That is a 4-hour exam. What they're doing with that is they are including critical thinking skills into the examination, and that means that they have adopted some new question formats, which include drag and drops, ordering. They do more scenario-based questions where they're asking you to identify key pieces of information that lead you to a differential diagnosis, for example. And so for us to be able to implement that in the classroom and be really successful in terms of preparing that student for that type of examination, Mark has approved us to purchase what's called Nearpod. It's a software program, it's a cloud-based software program that will include those types of drag and drops and matching type questions. So hopefully we can build the content. I've already started building content for that, but I did want to make you all aware as faculty members that that is going to change the entire examination procedure for those graduates. The ones that finish in December of this year, they will be under the old standard, but the ones that are starting that will finish in December of next year will be under the new. There will be no psychomotor examinations anymore after this December class. So the psychomotor examinations is going to be required by the State Office of EMS, and it's going to be embedded and ingrained in the last semester of the course. So it's going to be easier in some ways and also more difficult in others. So there's a little bit of a learning curve here, and of course we've got to spend some time building and developing content to help meet that new standard. So that is the changes with that. Please make sure that you utilize the documentation that is provided to you for the courses that you're teaching. You can always open the door to the equipment closet in the auditorium, and hanging on the wall right next to it is all of the paperwork, extra copies in case you should need something. And also there is a form that's been laminated and taped to the wall right there that says exactly what types of paperwork you need. And what has happened is we've had several occasions in the last few classes where the wrong survey is being used for the wrong type of course. So we just want to make sure that that's very clear and it's well delineated out. If you have any questions about that, please come to me. We'll figure it out. We also want to make sure that you, when you're at the end of your course, make sure you turn off all your TVs, sign out of the computer, and you want to make sure you go through the entire building and check every single door to the external part of the building. We have had an issue where someone was in the building that shouldn't have been in here, and they tried to jam the door to where they could come back in and out overnight. So we need to make sure that the doors are fully locked, and that means if you're by yourself, you really want to have at least 2 of you doing that check by the end of the night. So make sure that you do that. There is faculty scorecards for the last year available for you to review, and I do need a signature on those. So hopefully with this video we'll also catch up on that. If you need to order a polo, if you're short on polos or you don't have any, please reach out to me. We will be placing that order in the next few weeks. And then the American Heart Association ACLS and PALS. We are partnering with CAMC to offer the American Heart Association ACLS and PALS in particular. Now we're not getting rid of ASHE. ASHE is still going to be our primary point, but for ACLS and PALS, we are going to utilize CAMC. So if you have an interest as a faculty member to gain that certification to teach that, please let me know, because we will be trying to get that course hosted by CAMC in the spring. And finally, we'll go into the professional development for today, which is defining and implementing cultural humility, both in teaching and in precepting. So today we're going to talk about what culture is. We're going to explain the difference between cultural humility versus cultural competence, and we're going to talk about some effective communication in a multicultural environment. And so the reason why we're having to do this is the Commission, or the Committee on Accreditation of EMS Programs, has included a new standard that says that we must provide some sort of training or orientation to include cultural humility. So this is doing us twofold on the workload, because one, we're going ahead and we're providing this as a professional development curriculum, and then we are also going to be incorporating this to meet that standard. So we have to ask ourselves, what is culture? What are we trying to do? Well, first of all, culture is really a mental construct. This is acquired consciously and unconsciously from our parents, family, friends, and schools, and also from our religious teachings, and it's modeled through our language and through others. Matter of fact, by the time we reach age 5, many of those foundational aspects are already internalized, and by the time we reach our teenage years, those foundational aspects have now been elaborated on, because we're socializing and we're trying to figure our place in the world as teenagers. So we want to talk about the definition of culture, and it comprises beliefs about reality, how people should interact with each other, what they know about the world, and how they should respond to the social and material environments in which they find themselves. And it's really reflected in the religions, the morals, customs, technology, and even survival strategies that make up the area that you live in. So culture will affect not only who we are as individuals, but it gets permeated through all aspects of our lives. It includes what we see in our work, how we work, what we expect of work, our parents, how we parent, how we love others, our thoughts on marriage, understanding health, mental health, wellness, illness, even death and disability. So, you know, if you look at some of the cultures have a very specific view on the elderly, and they revere their elderly, and it's very different depending on your culture as to how you approach that. You know, some people are more about putting their elderly in the nursing homes and then dealing with it there. In other religions or other cultures, they have more of a vested interest in ensuring that their elderly are revered and cared for very carefully, so their approach is very different. And it just can't be that simple. Culture also has subcultures that are contained within it, and that can be based on gender, age, class. As you can see, there's a whole laundry list here. And a good example of this would be like Generation X. These were the ones that were born between 1965 and 1981. They're actually referred to as the feral generation, and that is the idea of a subculture. So there's very distinctive characteristics that set this particular group apart from other generations, and that's just a good example of a subculture that I can provide you. But you can also have subcultures in terms of, we talk about Southerners. There's a difference in norms and customs and worldviews that accrue as a result of where we were born and how we were raised. So we talk about Southerners, and you know, we have to have our sweet tea, and you don't drink tea without sugar in it. There's just different things with the Southerners, and that's just another good example of how there are some differences in those cultural norms and customs that we do on a daily basis. Also, your roles and expectations can be different between the genders, and roles may vary from one ethnic group to another. So those are very specific areas. Some cultures think of women as inferior to men, so their approach on how they interact and engage is very different. That affects us as EMS providers in particular, because if we have someone that is of that particular culture, then they may not want someone of a different sex, like a male hospital provider actually providing care to a female. So that's just a good example of that. And then you have this thing called acculturation. I'm going to try to say that without stuttering, but this is an intra-ethnic variation. And they use the example, and it's listed here on the slide. You've got a Mayan immigrant that comes in from Mexico to the United States, and they are going to retain their core cultural values from their native upbringing. But this becomes modified or added to over time because of the amount and quality of interactions and contacts within the United States and the society. So sons and daughters of those individuals will actually retain some of the parental values and the ideations, but they're also going to acquire some cultural norms that are far more prevalent in mainstream society. But the idea of acculturation and assimilation is where it's either a process of losing and or gaining cultural traits. And the problem with this is it can be very unpredictable. It can be very uneven. You may have one individual of a particular culture that is closely related to someone else, and they have a very different idea because of the way they've been assimilated into the current culture that they are in. So that's what makes this a little bit more difficult. So culture and personal identity, this is our sense of self, and this is that sense of self is how we grew up and how we were socialized, and seeking acceptance is essential to our sense of security. So culture and personal identity kind of ingrain and embed within each other because we want to be accepted by the people that we're closest to, and whether that be of the same culture or of a different culture, that may be where we kind of adjust and you see that assimilation occur. Now, personal identities are also not static, so that's something to remember. It's derived from cultural conceptualizations, and a good example of this is women. Women over the course of their lifetime are looked at in very different ways. So you have the woman that is considered a wife, but they also may be a mother, or they could be a divorcee. At some point they may become a grandmother. But not only that, that woman may also work. She could be a factory worker, that could also be a refugee. So each one carries a set of cultural norms and expectations. And anytime you have a migration from one culture to the next, they may adopt new ideas and keep some of the older ones. So that's part of that assimilation. If you remember earlier, we mentioned that by the age of 5, many of the foundational aspects of culture have already been internalized. And there is a part of the unconscious script that exists in the United States, and it's something that we need to address. This is a video, and I'm going to hope that the sound and the video play, but this is a video from 2006. And I just want you to kind of take a look at this.
We brought together 3 groups of kids at this day camp and showed them pictures of 2 men, one Arab, the other Asian.
Who do you like better, this man or this man?
The Chinese guy.
Over and over, they said they liked the Asian man more than the Arab.
He looks meaner and he looks nicer. Because he looks nicer? Yeah, he does look nicer, and he has a smile on.
But both men are smiling. And what do the kids think about the personalities of the men?
Let me ask, you don't know this person, but what do you think he's like?
I think he's weird.
Why is he weird?
He just doesn't look like a very nice person. No. He looks like a scary dude.
He's on the phone. What's he talking about?
Maybe a raspberry.
Then I ask about the Asian man.
What's he like?
He looks like a regular teenager to me.
We then showed them pictures of a black man and a white man. What were some comments about the black man?
He looks mean. FBI most wanted. He looks weird. He looks like he's a basketball player.
So, tell me about this guy. He seemed like a nice person.
I think he's nice. I think he's nice, except he might be mad about something.
He was probably picking up on something. This is Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. But when we asked which man is a criminal, most kids pointed to the black man. And when we asked which was a teacher, they said,
That one! The guy in the green shirt.
So I wanted to show you that video because if you remember, by age 5, many of our foundational cultures and beliefs have already been solidified. And this just kind of shows how deeply ingrained this can be. Now, that black man in the video is actually an award-winning Harvard professor of economics. So just kind of give you a little bit of background on that. So this is a good example. I know this was in 2006, but I think it's still pretty relevant for today. Unknowingly, we are passing on these mental scripts or belief structures to our children and giving them a very specific view of the world through the lens of ethnocentrism. And this is where you believe that your culture is the most important culture in the world and your culture's beliefs are the most valid out there. So in the past, that script has been very blatant. In the 1960s and 1970s, Native American women were unknowingly being sterilized against their will. This included cases in some as young as 11 years old, and they weren't the only ones. This also included African Americans and even those whose only crime was just being poor. It is actually estimated that the number of sterilizations could be as high as 70,000 women under the age of 21. And the motivation for this was after forcing the Indian population onto the reservations, a lot of those individuals were dependent on government organizations such as welfare. So it was decided that sterilization would improve their financial situation and their family's quality of life. And here is another example. In 1927, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court. This was Buck versus Bell. And it actually upheld an involuntary sterilization of the female child that you see here in this picture. The court reviewed 3 generations of Buck women and deemed that there was such an intellectual deficiency that these deficiencies were hereditary and clearly caused a danger to public welfare. So they referred to these women as feeble-minded and promiscuous. And in their idea of how this should be is that it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their own imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from actually continuing their kind. That was what was said in the Supreme Court during that day. Now, Carrie is the child in the picture, and she was forced to undergo sterilization despite her only crime being a shy girl who was actually raped by the nephew of her adoptive mother. And while we have come very far from these days of segregation and discrimination, we still need to address many of the unconscious scripts cultivated from our past that can subconsciously influence our attitudes and behaviors today. And so this brings us to topic 2, is where we need to find a way to identify and interrupt these unconscious scripts, or history is doomed to repeat itself. So we have to talk about the difference between cultural competence versus cultural humility. And quite honestly, it is much more feasible to approach from the humility aspect, the window of humility, as opposed to cultural competence, because competence is actually defined as assess and identify commonalities amongst all cultures. And that can be very, very difficult, acquiring a specific knowledge base that drives interactions with individuals from different heritages. So that's the definition of competency. Whereas humility actually recognizes individual limitations in knowledge and skills and tries to align with the growth mindset of a lifelong learner, where you're trying to be more culturally aware. And that's being observant of similarities and differences that exist between cultural groups. So we want to have this goal in our classrooms and in the field, in the precepting realm, where we are fostering inclusivity. We want to empower the students. We want them to respect each other and respect you as the instructor. We want to see collaboration and lifelong learning. And cultural humility can counter some of the impediments to education. We want to try to stop the idea of stereotyping or marginalizing people or having that stigmatization or bullying that can happen. So a good example of this is you don't want to assume that an individual based on any subculture is either underprepared or overprepared for a course. When you do this, you can actually potentially ignore the need that would challenge a student and help them excel. So a good example of this is an employer expecting another administrator's son to know step by step what actually has to be done at shift change, and this is his very first day at work, and just because he's the child of an administrator, he was screamed at and yelled at, and that's because they expected him to know something that he really didn't. He had no prior knowledge of. So as an instructor or preceptor, we need to relinquish our expertise and allow that student to be the expert of their own identity and try to support the students and challenge them regarding their perceptions and exercise of power. And we want to promote acceptance in our classrooms. Here's the point here. All our historical scripts are going to precede us and undermine our best and most competent efforts. These unidentified scripts that put our needs above those we serve can put the latter at greater risk. So we need to try to nurture a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique and readdress any power imbalances in the educator/student or preceptor dynamic. So what would you do if your script was challenged? Most people, when they feel as though they are not validated, they will become very defensive. They'll dig their heels in. They may not want to listen anymore. So we have to approach every discussion authentically and with the mindset of open inquiry. We want students to argue and debate out questions in a healthy way, that does not create any type of power imbalance. We want them to debate. And that brings us to how we can effectively communicate in a multicultural environment. Socrates pushed his community and made them feel uncomfortable because he challenged their current beliefs. And that's the purpose of the university. We are here to question and provoke students to think outside the box and kind of change the ones that they cannot defend. So we want them to have that open, respectable debate. If I could recommend a book to research why we are where we are with our students, I would like you to read this book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Their text is very well referenced, and they do an excellent job identifying what makes today's students tick and why they respond the way they do. And these good social changes that we've had built and developed over the years bring up three very specific truths for today's society. And I want you to bear with me because I know you're going to want to argue this, but just hear me out for a minute. So the three truths include: what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. And during their research, Greg and Jonathan found that these three truths were faced by the American students today. And most of us kind of look at this and think, well, that can't be right. These really should be referred to as the three untruths. But this is what our students have been led to believe mentally that is going on. And the first untruth, which is called "what doesn't kill you makes you weaker," but I think that we can all agree that we need challenge in order to grow. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is a professor of risk in engineering at NYU, he's also the writer of The Black Swan, by the way. He argues that most of us think about risk in the wrong way. We are not China that is considered fragile, that has to be handled with care. Instead, we are anti-fragile, and we require regular physical and mental challenges and stressors, or we're going to deteriorate. So we all know what happens to our muscles after being in a cast for 3 months to heal a fracture. That muscle will atrophy, it's going to grow weaker, and as a result, and that all of that is the result of it not being challenged. So this is a good example of how that truth number one is really that we are anti-fragile. So we should focus on helping our students develop their innate abilities to grow and learn from their experiences. We want them to become resilient. This is a good picture of a gentleman that was participating in the Spartan race at the summit, Bechtel Reserve, back in 2017. And I have no idea what his experiences in life were, but it's very apparent from the picture that he wasn't willing to become weak and helpless. He very much finished the race and did very well. If a child is not allowed to experience risk and stressors that are a natural and unavoidable part of life, then they can be set up for the incapacity to adapt as adults. For our EMS students, we have to remind them that working in the field is always going to keep them working on the edge of their edge of their comfort zone. They're not going to be comfortable. And when they do become really comfortable, then they need to be very careful, because that's when they become complacent and accidents happen. But there is a man by the name of Van Jones, and if you ever have the chance to actually look at that YouTube video, it's pretty good. It's from him at the University of Chicago, and they're having a discussion with an audience, and his response was, we should be preparing the child for the road, not the road for the child. He said, I want you to be strong. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. You need to put on some boots. When you come to a college setting or when you're in classes, you should be ready to debate. It's a place where you can say things and someone else can say things, and you can not agree with what either one of you said, but you're going to agree to disagree, or you're going to try to work through it and come up with some sort of resolution that you're both happy with. But the goal here is that you're able to debate in a safe format. Unfortunately, the idea of what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. This is the result of a new culture that's referred to as safetyism. The idea being that we need to clear the path for anything that might upset them, and that is actually what leads to the fragility. So Nick Haslam wrote an article in 2016 called The Concept Creep. This is psychology's expanding concepts of harm and pathology. And what he discovered was that since the 1980s, the words such as abuse, bullying, trauma, or prejudice, they were actually changed. So if you see here, you have trauma. Trauma was originally defined as physical damage. But, let me click down here. Over time, that definition became broader and more expanded out, and we started looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. And in 1980, that was defined as the evoked significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone outside the range of usual human experience. And now in the early 2000s, this was redefined as experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So this really, really expanded out to a brand new phenomena. You know, what you see here is an example of how trauma was changed to include emotional damage. And just like the word trauma, the term safety also underwent a transformation to include forms outside of physical safety and included mental and emotional safety. So it's important to note that this preoccupation with safetyism began at a very specific time. Jean Twenge was a psychologist at San Diego State University. She's an authority on intergenerational differences, and she determined that a sharp continuity began around 1995 and is the result of teenagers growing up with iPhones, and those came out in 2007. As a result, she identified the cut point for millennials, and those born after 1995 were part of the Gen Z or iGen, and she calls them the iGen generation because that's the group that they were checking their social status every few minutes. So she was very good to kind of catch that. And your millennials actually got a bad rap. It was the iGen, when they arrived on campus in 2013, that you started to see that preoccupation with safetyism begin. But avoiding triggers is actually a symptom of PTSD, not a treatment. What if we use cognitive behavioral therapy? We involve gradual systemic exposure to traumatic memories until their capacity to trigger actually will diminish. So this puts us directly into the untruth number 2, where you always trust your feelings. The big thing to remember here is that feelings can be not so good. They can lead you to all kinds of problems. So the problem with believing or trusting your feelings is that it can distort reality, it can actually deprive you of insight, and it can damage your relationships. Now, there are 9 most cognitive distortions that was actually identified by Leahy, Holland, and McGinn, and these include emotional reasoning. I feel anxious, therefore I know I'm already going to fail this skill station. You know, catastrophizing the world, I'm going to die. I would just die if I didn't pass National Registry. Yeah, you're probably not going to die. Life will not end. That's catastrophizing. Overgeneralizing, this always happens to me. I fail at everything. And then you can have that dichotomous thinking where it's the all or none principle. Like, this was a complete and utter waste of my time. I learned nothing. Did you really learn nothing, or did you learn something you just are choosing to think of it as a complete waste? You know, mind reading. This preceptor hates me. He thinks I'm a loser. Well, did you really ask him that? Labeling. How many times have we seen this? Like a very common one is, you know, oh, if he can pass National Registry, if that person can pass National Registry, then there's no reason why I can't pass National Registry. We're labeling people. Negative filtering. You know, I made a C. You know, I'm so flippin' stupid. Discounting the positives. Someone gives you a compliment and says, you know, you did really well at something. No, you kind of discount it. You kind of play it off like, yeah, it's not as big of a deal as you think. And then blaming. You know, you're blaming other people for your mistakes. So in 1960, Aaron Beck found a close connection between the thoughts a person had with the feelings that came with them. And what he saw is that they can get caught up in this feedback loop that is very irrational negative beliefs, and it causes that, it drove reasoning and motivated people to find evidence to support the negative beliefs. So we want to look at using cognitive behavioral therapy as a way to break that cycle, that irrational negative cycle. It is definitely not what you see here with the Butthurt Report. And there is a guy by the name of Jonathan Haidt. He's the one that wrote co-wrote the book on coddling of the American mind. And he actually gives you an idea where you reference the brain in 2 parts. You have the writer. The writer is the controlled conscious processing. This is your language-based thinking. They're the ones, this is your like executive function where you're using rational thought to logically work through something. And then you have the elephant. Now that elephant is an uncontrolled, unconscious, that's our intuitive mind. It's part of that limbic system, that old section of the brain that is all about trying to keep us out of danger. It's about that fight or flight response. And if you think about this, in terms of the rider and the elephant here in the picture, the rider may actually believe that he's in control, but if you look at the size of the elephant, he's vastly stronger, and he's gonna tend to win any conflict that rises between the two. If he really tried to steer him right and the elephant didn't want to go right, he's big enough that he could override it. The rider will generally function more like the elephant's servant than in the master, and the rider is extremely skilled at producing justifications for whatever the elephant does or believes. So a good example of this is, the elephant says, oh, we're in water and there's crocodiles here, we're not safe. The rider says, okay, we'll go with it. So that's where he's kind of giving in to that mental process. But that is that emotional reasoning that is creating a cognitive distortion for us. So we want to look instead at cognitive behavioral therapy, where the riders start asking the question, this conscious executive thought process, have we ever been attacked here? And the elephant says no. And he says, well, besides we're in Mongolia, they don't have crocodiles. So the elephant says, oh, okay, true. So this is a good example of using cognitive behavioral therapy in a good way. So when we approach our students in the classroom and they have that exaggerated reaction to something that's going on, this is a way where we can kind of approach them with logic and reason and make them work through that and stop that negative loop. And that brings us to untruth number 3, where you have this idea that life is a battle between good and evil people. Okay, so now we're moving on to the third untruth, which life is a battle between good and evil people. And just take a minute to look at this picture here. So you have a kid, he's sprawled out across the streets in the middle of the subway system. This guy comes along and he decides to sit on his legs. And if you look at the kid's face, he looks deeply offended, and the guy doesn't seem to care too much. So you have to ask yourself the question, well, who in this situation is considered good and who is considered evil? Unfortunately, reality is far more complicated than the narrative actually is. And if someone actually chooses to construct a narrative about what they think is right or wrong or who is to blame, and as a result of that, people tend to get demonized. And that leads us into this idea, this concept of tribalism, where you have a common enemy identity politics, and these microaggressions, they're not uncommon and have been seen throughout history in the form of witch hunts. And we look here at the typical witch hunt that was most famous in Salem, where it was said that the community became obsessed with either a religious or ideological purity, and that it needed to find and punish the enemies within its own ranks in order to hold itself together. A few years earlier, Massachusetts experienced a border war against the French. Again, it was all about a response to a sense of danger and a loss of cohesion in the group. So they felt like they needed to react in response to that. And when it comes to political witch hunts, there's 4 very distinct features that are common to this. First, it appears in a very dramatic outburst. Charges appear that as a part or in whole put the collective's existence at stake. So it's trying to be undermined or subverted. And then typically the innocent person makes some sort of trivial act. And a lot of times friends and bystanders are afraid to actually say anything, and they side with the accused is an offense against the group, so they don't want to get involved. So they arise quickly, crimes against the collective, charges, and fear of defending the accused. So no matter how good a person you are, you're going to be an evil in someone's story. And I think that's really important to remember. So that leaves us with a question. Should we be teaching solidarity in our EMS classes, or should we just embrace diversity. And just like one of my favorite phrases I use in class is "it depends." Well, in reality, solidarity is great for working in unison to get a job done, which is what we need to do when we're out on the ambulance. There are conditions and situations where you are trying to develop critical thinking, and in that case, diversity is actually necessary. We talk about using open inquiry as a student-centered approach to learning, and that's where we have the ability in the classroom to foster the freedom to ask questions without fear of reprisal, and it allows us to debate topics in a healthy way. But in order for open inquiry to work, we have to accept the fact that we are flawed thinkers. We have a strong preference for believing that our idea is right, and that can lead to confirmation bias. We will vigorously search for evidence that confirms what we already believe. And if we don't have diverse thinking, then people will congregate around methods and ideas that generally conform to the shared narrative, and they will ignore those questions and methods that don't offer that support to the narrative. But we must practice intellectual humility and admit when we are mistaken, and be gracious to those who gave us the new perspective. And that leads us to a point. We have to talk about navigating conflict. If we are asking our students to engage in discussion on topics, then we have to be prepared to navigate or deploy methods to prevent or circumvent the conflict that escalates in an unhealthy way. All it takes is one student to make a comment or call a slight offense, and that slight offense is also referenced as a microaggression, and that can trigger what's referred to as the call-out culture. And they are defined as brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, whether it's intentional or unintentional, that actually communicate hostility, they're derogatory, or negative, they indicate negative slights or insults. And while it's undeniable that some members of various identity groups encounter repeated indignities because of their culture, even if none of those offenders harbor an ill will, it's their clueless or ignorant questions that can become burdensome and hard to tolerate. But what if we chose to give benefit of the doubt? Today's generation, and to a lesser degree the millennials, are quick to embrace the level of being a victim. If, as instructors, we are not vigilant, then this can cause the program to fail because students will quickly become fearful of speaking up or engaging in any type of healthy discussion. And if this happens, you will lose the unity, solidarity, and trust necessary for success in the classroom. As the schema takes hold, we become more likely to see hostility in even the most benevolent of comments. And this is when those misunderstandings that lead to perceived microaggressions occur and escalation into large-scale conflicts. And because of this response to safetyism, some institutions have even adopted hotlines where students can call anonymously to report any bias or discrimination or harassment that they experience. The end result is the professor feels like they're walking on eggshells. Check out this statement from Professor Gerson at Harvard Law. Asking students to challenge each other in discussion of rape law has become so difficult that teachers are starting to give up on the subject entirely. If the subject of sexual assault were to be left out of the law school, the classroom, it would be to the detriment of all involved, including and most importantly the victims. If asked, a 2017 report by FIRE found that 471 institutions and 181 maintain some form of bias reporting systems. In 2014, Campbell and Manning defined the new culture as the victimhood culture, and it is comprised of 3 very specific attributes. They're highly sensitive to slights. They handle conflicts through some sort of third party. They don't want to just go to the person and indicate that they're having an issue. And they cultivate an image of victims who deserve assistance. And that becomes a problem because they start to spiral into this learned helplessness. They believe that they cannot escape and that they might as well just give up and stop trying, even in situations where the effort might actually be rewarding. And that victimhood culture is different from 2 other types of cultures that we have seen in America. The first is the dignity culture, which is still dominant in most parts of the United States. This was the era where sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never harm you. And people have dignity and worth regardless of what others may think of them. And things like minor slights were not acted upon so strongly. People were expected to have self-control and shrug off irritations, slights, minor conflicts. If they were part of larger conflicts or violations, then you would use some reliable either legal or administrative remedies, but it was always considered undignified to go to such extreme manners for such small things. Then there's the honor culture. This group is older than the dignity culture, and this is where men were expected to guard their reputations, and they would react violently even to minor insults. And an example of this was when they would challenge each other to duels. So how can we do our part to try to foster independence and this idea of being able to debate comfortably in a classroom and not have this culture of victimhood? Well, we need to foster courage over caution. We need and must hold our students accountable for their actions and preach open communication between parties rather than external intervention. And if we spot an employee, a student, or even a child, if you're at home and you're dealing with children, and they are distorting reality, we can gently correct those distortions that interfere with the task at hand, ask a series of questions to encourage the student to ground their assertions into something that's textual, and consider alternatives. But if the scholar cannot rebuke or reconcile disconfirming evidence, then they have to drop their claims, or otherwise they're going to lose their respect. So this is how we actually promote critical thinking skills in the classroom. Something else we may see are the misunderstandings, and these, like I said before, are sometimes referenced as microaggressions, and these can happen every day. They're defined as brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether it be intentional or unintentional, that actually communicate hostility, derogatory, or negative slights or insults. And while it's undeniable that some members of various identity groups actually encounter this a lot, even if the person offers no ill will, those clueless and ignorant actions can actually become very burdensome. So what we want to do in the classroom is try to have the pre-training. So like we're doing today, we're talking about how to address these situations before they occur. You can do this with your students when they come in for orientation of the program, where you're engaging them in productive and beneficial methods. So, being polite, trying to avoid giving accidental or thoughtless offense. And really it's just the promoting this principle of charity, because you want to give the person the benefit of the doubt. I'm guessing you didn't mean any harm when you said this, but you need to know that some people might interpret it to mean something else that's more derogatory, whatever that may be. And just understanding that you also have to consider intent versus impact. A faux pas, a simple faux pas, does not make someone evil, and that's really important to remember. And the final area that we need to look at for this generation is the idea of justice. And today's society looks at intuitive justice, which is a combination of both distributive and procedural. The definition of distributive is that people are getting what is deserved, while procedural justice is the way in which things are distributed in a fair and trustworthy manner. And in all reality, most people, if there's a clash, most people would prefer to have fair inequality over unfair equality. So that's where that kind of comes into play. As instructors and as preceptors, we can be much more willing to accept the decision and work through it, even as students, if they can see that they are treated with dignity, if they're given a voice, and they are being taken seriously. And if you need to motivate support for a new policy or some sort of movement in the name of justice, then all you have to do is trigger that emotional elephant that we talked about earlier. If you can't elicit at least one of those feelings, then people will be content with the status quo, even if that means that someone else ends up with something more. Maintaining open inquiry. What are we doing to prepare our students? All of this begins on day one of class. We want to develop solidarity and unity, and we want to invoke the use of open inquiry, where we provide the students with the expectations of humility, just as we've talked about today. And this can be done both in the school setting and also in the precepting field. You can provide that in either way. On day one, I began to find ways to unify the group through what's referred to as the humanity approach. And Dr. Martin Luther King was an exceptional study of this particular approach. He knew how to appeal to the shared morals and identities of Americans and actually strove to humanize his opponents to appeal to their humanity, whereas other individuals used more of a demonizing approach to their enemies, and that's where you end up with these witch hunts and the idea of tribalism. So we want to tie in the behaviors for team building with communication skills that we want to see, and we talk about ways to reject those cognitive distortions, and we want to try to promote that principle of charity. And finally, we utilize in the classroom setting the iCare Code of Ethics, which stands for integrity, compassion, accountability, respect, and empathy. And I spend time with the classes when I'm teaching the paramedic program, and I know this is also done in the EMT course, reviewing what the expectations of the program are and the affective or behavioral evaluations that those students will receive. And I also will ask them to sign a professional behavior agreement that holds themselves accountable to this during class. So as instructors, as preceptors, we can prepare students for controversy just by holding each other accountable and requiring them to make a well-reasoned argument. We don't want to allow that conflict or that debate between two individuals to become an emotional debate, because that's when that elephant takes over. We need to maintain that rational, logical thinking brain. So let's just summarize. Culture is applicable to all people. It is active and dynamic. It changes over time. It changes with migration. It changes when we meet new challenges. And it changes through our interactions with other groups. And it's based on the climate. It is multi-layered, that is malleable over time, and should always be considered within a context. And we use Shrek here to just say that there's many layers to Shrek, just like an onion. And culture structures our perceptions. It actually will shape our behavior, and it is considered the total way of our lives and how we live. And what we should do with all of our students is to promote the idea and to practice the idea of cultural humility. This is a professional mindset that is essential for success in interactions in the multicultural environment. We're going to do this in a bunch of ways, and we're going to just rehash the highlights, which we've already spoke of. So whether we're students, instructors, or preceptors, remembering that we are all prone to that emotional reasoning, and we should practice the ideas of cognitive behavioral therapy and try to implement mindfulness. That's the goal here. Paying attention in the moment without exercising judgment and being able to remain calm and present. We should practice the virtue of intellectual humility, where we embrace our own bias as being right, and we want to have others around us who are willing to disagree, because it provides us with a great amount of growth as human beings. And admit that we're wrong when we're wrong, and thank the critics for helping you find it, because they made you a better person. We want students to practice debate. Now, I realize this is a little different in a classroom, but there's always a way. You think about different ways you can approach different subjects, and how those students can argue over, something as simple as how to properly place someone in a backboard, for example, and how to strap them down. Those can change from one location to another. So allowing them to debate is really helpful in that situation. But we want to explicitly reject the untruth or fragility. We want them to be able to create and develop well-reasoned arguments and reject that emotional reasoning. We want them to hold each other accountable, as we said, and they should be able to provide evidence to substantiate their assertions in order to pursue truth. Explicitly reject the idea that there's good and evil. We want to talk about the ways that we unwittingly or unknowingly offend or exclude people, how we should encourage politeness and empathy. We want to keep that charitable frame of mind. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt, the principle of charity. We want to encourage them to try to resolve things informally and in private, and we really need to foster school spirit, because the larger the circle, the greater we can unite people under that common humanity theory that Martin Luther King was really good at. And just remember, don't embrace ignorance, enlighten yourself, expose yourself to others that have, to other cultures, have other opinions, and break through any of those cognitive dissonance and try to free your mind from the confirmation bias that can be seen with ethnocentrism, where individuals are bound to the idea that their belief is the only belief that's correct. And I want to thank you for your time. I know this is a long lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to discuss. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you.